my name's Mr. McQuire. I want to welcome you to this presentation today on hormones and reproduction. And in today's lesson we will be looking at glands that release hormones and how those glands change our bodies. This builds on top of 3 earlier lessons where we looked at reflexes. Then we built up a picture of the eye as a receptor as part of the nervous system, and then we moved sideways looking at effectors, which are glands, looking at 2 hormones in particular, insulin and adrenaline. And today we are looking at hormones that are involved in reproduction. On the screen in front of you, you can see the word estrogen and you can see the word testosterone. And we're going to be looking in detail at those today and their roles in the reproductive systems of humans. Before we go any further, it would save time later in the lesson if you had the ability to be able to control and print screen, which is in the top right hand corner of your keyboard. So pressing those 2 buttons then will take the image from the screen in front of you. If you pause the presentation first, and will then allow you to paste that into Word. If you have the ability to print, that will save lots of time later in the lesson, or we will need to have sketch diagrams of reproductive systems. If you need to pause the presentation to allow you to do that, then please do so now, if you can think of a way of getting those images so that you can electronically label them or on paper label them if you have that available to you. So before we start, we need that diagram, or you need to have some paper to allow you to draw those diagrams. We need somewhere quiet to be able to work and free from distractions. Paper and pen, as I've already said. Okay, so let's just have a look at our Prestarter for a moment. Do you know where male and female sex hormones are produced? This was mentioned in the previous presentation that I did, and you have got 60 seconds perhaps to look back through your notes or try and recall where male and female sex hormones are produced. As the music dies away, let's have a look at the answers. First of all, estrogen is the female sex hormone that is produced by the ovaries, and testosterone is the male sex hormone that's produced by the testes. Please notice O estrogen and O ovaries, and test at the beginning of both of those to help you remember those. In terms of the spelling, estrogen is probably better in your mind pronounced estrogen, because that's literally what it says, and maybe that will help you say it. Bit of a Scottish accent sometimes helps with that as well. Okay, estrogen and testosterone. Okay, our learning outcomes for today. We have loads to do today, and it's an exciting journey that we're going on, so let's see where we're heading. First of all, our challenge. We're going to identify the correct terms for male and female reproductive organs. So we're going to have to do some reproduction diagrams and learn the correct terminology that we would use talking to a professional like a doctor. Aspire, well, we're going to plan the journey of gametes. So our aim is to complete using something called gametes, the sex cells, sperm and egg, and we're going to talk about the journey that they would take to enable them to fertilize each other. So we need to look backwards before we can go forwards today, and let's look back at Key Stage 2 and primary school work for a moment. On the right hand side we have a picture of a female frog that would lay eggs, called frog spawn as we would call it, which is fertilized as it's laid by a male frog. That results in a tadpole, which is about 4 o'clock if you use the diagram, and then they grow legs, and then they gradually begin to evolve and the tail is reabsorbed, and we end up with an adult frog. We have again on the left hand side the life cycle of a butterfly, which again would lay eggs, for example on a cabbage, which would turn into a caterpillar, which then at some point in its life, if it's not eaten, will end up in a chrysalis and will stay there until it's transformed magically into an adult butterfly, and at that point then it's capable of reproduction and laying an egg. Now the same thing occurs in humans. We have stages when we are not capable of reproducing, and it's important that we recognize those changes because they are controlled by hormones. So here is a human life cycle. I'd like you to have a look at this for 60 seconds, and I'd like you to tell me at what stage you think humans can start to reproduce on this diagram. Okay, so let's have a look at this for a second and just make sure that we're thinking on the same page. We've got a fertilized egg, which we're going to talk about today on the diagram in front of you, which evolves into a fetus, which after 9 months is a baby, and that obviously then develops and grows and becomes a child. Okay, at that point then that child develops further and becomes an adolescent, and that adolescent becomes an adult. So the question that I asked you is, at what stage can reproduction start? And the answer is in the period of adolescence, which is the point where hormones in the body begin to change the body to allow it to reproduce. Now we could spend many hours, and scientists have spent many years looking at why it is that animals are not born able to reproduce very quickly. There are some organisms that get to the point of reproduction very, very quickly, such as rats, for example, so they can have lots of babies very quickly. And there are some organisms that are incredibly slow at reaching the point of reproduction, and that includes us. I think a lot of it is to do with the development of the brain. Because we can't be born with a brain that's full-sized, because literally we cannot be delivered by a mother with a full-size head. So therefore we have to develop our brains, and at that point then we're capable of reproduction. Adolescence is the stage we're looking at. Okay, so let's start building up some useful notes for today's journey. First of all, I'd like you to put the title of Hormones and Reproduction, and then we're going to start developing some knowledge that we can use. Hopefully some of this is known to you already. So the first bullet point, human children are born with a complete set of sexual organs, so that would include ovaries in a woman and testes in a man, but these don't begin to function until between the ages of around 10 to 18. This stage of development is called puberty, and that is an important word for us to learn today. In males, the testes start to produce sperm during puberty, and in females, the ovaries start to release eggs. Now, if we just stop for a moment before I give you time to write these notes down, look at the key words at the bottom of the page. We have egg, which is a female reproductive gamete or sex cell, which is released from the ovary. Then we have a word oviduct, which is part of the female reproductive system. Then we have the male sex organ, which is the penis, and we have then parts of the male reproductive organs like scrotum, this male sex cell or gamete called the sperm, the testes where the sperm is released from. Then we have the vagina again, which we're going to learn parts of and in its role in reproduction today, and the uterus or womb where a fetus develops into a baby and is born after 9 months. So those are our key words. What I'd like you to do is to put down the heading that's there, hormones and reproduction. There's a subheading then of puberty, and then we've got 3 bullet points. Now I'm going to give you 3 minutes to do that, but I will start the timer when you've got 1 minute left. So when you are ready, I'll start the timer now. Okay, there's a lot of detailed information on the page that you have just written on. So let's just be careful again. First of all, the development stage is called puberty, and the testes start to make sperm in a boy, and the ovaries start to release eggs in a girl. That's your main points that I need you to remember from that slide, and we're going to recall those later in the lesson. So let's have a look first of all at the gametes then, or sex cells that are released. Now you can see there's a 60-second timer coming, which means that I need the information putting down. I've reduced this so that it's as brief as possible. So sexual reproduction involves two parents and sex cells called gametes. First bullet point, the female gamete or sex cell is the egg cell, and the male gamete or sex cell is called the sperm cell. Now we have two photographs there of a female egg on the left hand side, and we have lots and lots of sperm cells on the right hand side, which are capable of moving because they have a tail or flagella. And we're going to learn more about those in your science course over time, as they are very important cells that are specialized in our bodies. But for now, let's just learn the principal parts, which are female gamete, egg cell, male gamete, sperm cell. So I'd like you now please to put the title of gametes and then in brackets sex cells, underline that clearly please, and I'd like you to put that opening sentence and the two bullet points that are there. So you've got a minute to do that please. Okay, superb. Now, hopefully, if you've completed those notes, then you could answer the following question. What is another name for sex cells? The answer that you should be looking at is gametes. What is the female sex cell? And that is an egg. Let me change the question. What is the male gamete? And the answer is sperm. And people struggle obviously to recall the word gamete and change the word sex cell for it. So just be careful with those. If you need more time to finish your notes, then please pause the presentation now as we move on. Okay, so this hasn't got a timer on it, so we're not going to write this down, but it's interesting information. We have a photograph there of the inside of a part of the female reproductive system called an oviduct, and in there we have microscopic hairs which are called cilia. We also have them in our noses, which is interesting, and these waft the egg along and push it down the tube towards the womb or uterus. That's obviously a journey that's needed if it's going to be fertilized by sperm which are swimming upwards on their journey to fertilize the egg. Let's just have a look at what's written here. In order for sexual reproduction to take place, the gametes or sex cells must be able to meet. The reproductive organs are adapted to enable this to happen. The female gamete, the ovary, has to travel down the oviduct or fallopian tube from the ovary. Obviously, then to allow them to meet, we need to talk about how the sexual organs of a man and the sexual organs of a woman are adapted to allow that to occur. The male gamete, or the sperm cell, is released from the testes. In order to be released through the penis, the sperm are mixed with fluid from the gland. The sperm and fluid together are called semen. So a man releases something called semen during sexual intercourse, and that's a mixture of sperm and a fluid that is produced by the man in something called a gland, which you'll see in a picture shortly, and he releases something called semen. So we're now coming to the part of this presentation where we are going to label the male and female reproductive systems. Now, if you haven't been able to produce any kind of electronic or printed version of the diagram that is here, what I would like you to do is to allow the slide to move on to the next one, where we will see bigger pictures of these, and you will need to produce sketch diagrams with the arrows ready to label, so that you can label the parts with the proper terms that you would use talking to a doctor about the parts of a reproductive system. So if you need to pause and try and do the print screen that I talked about earlier, or you need to copy these diagrams, just allow the presentation to move forward and you'll see bigger versions of this later on. So this is a larger version of the previous slide. If you don't have an electronic or printed version of the male reproductive system, then I'd like you to pause the presentation and sketch a diagram with the arrows pointing exactly where the parts are here. Now I'm going to go through this particular diagram now in some detail, and then we're going to add the labels to your diagram. We're then going to add the functions to the labels on the diagram, so we've got a lot of detailed information to get across, but let's run through these now. First of all, starting up on the top side here, we have a tube, and this tube here carries sperm from the testes through to the ureter, and this sperm is called the sperm tube or duct. You can see the journey that goes on up through here and round past this yellow gland here that we'll talk about in a second, and then we have this tube here that we're going to label next. So we've got the urethra there, and finally the bottom left hand diagram where male sperm is produced from, and that is a testis. As we said earlier, that during sex a man produces semen, which is a mixture of sperm and a fluid, and the fluid is produced from this particular thing that's called the gland that's here. So we have two of those called the glands. Now the urethra runs down the center of the penis. It carries both urine and it carries semen. There's the penis labeled, and then finally we have the sac made of skin that holds the testes, which can't be as warm as the human body because the sperm is damaged by that, so therefore they're held outside the body, and that particular part of the reproductive system is called the scrotum. Okay, now if you need to pause that image now, just get the labels that are there. Please make sure they're small enough to allow you to put down some functions, because we're going to add that as part of today's lesson, because we're identifying correct terms in the challenge at the top of the page for male and female reproductive organs, but we also need to know about the journey of the sex cells, which in this case would be the sperm from the testes round the sperm tube, down the urethra, which runs through the center of the penis. Just make sure that diagram's completed properly before you move on. Now let's make sure we've got a detailed diagram or sketch diagram of the female reproductive system. Label it as female reproductive system. These are quite large diagrams. Obviously this is situated inside a woman, but this is just that reproductive system that we've talked about. So we're going to learn these words now to make sure that we can use them properly. Starting up on the top left here, this is an arrow that's pointing towards the uterus or womb. Either of those two words will do, but womb is spelled womb, W-O-M-B, but I would like you to use the word uterus. Now underneath that we have the ovary, which is where the eggs are stored and released from. So they're the source of the eggs, which are gametes, of course. We'll keep using that word. Down here we have an arrow that's pointing very specifically towards the lining of the uterus that's here. That's part of the menstrual cycle, which we're going to learn about as part of this particular topic as well. So here we have the lining of the uterus, which is built up and shed during the menstrual cycle. On the top right hand side here we have the fallopian tube, sometimes called the oviduct, and that carries the egg from the ovary through to the uterus. Now at the bottom of the uterus we have this muscular circle here, which if a person was pregnant it would hold the baby in, and that's where the baby has to be born through first, and that particular part is called the cervix. That gets wider and wider during the hours of labour before a baby is born. And then finally down at the bottom we have the tube that leads through to the cervix, which is called the vagina. Now you need those labels, again make them small enough to have enough room around those to write down functions for these particular labels. You need to pause the presentation to get those labels and that diagram properly. It will take quite a long time to do it properly and accurately. Please take that time to do that now. So we're now going to add to our reproduction diagrams the functions of the parts that are on those diagrams. So what do the different parts of the human reproductive system do? But I'd like to give you 60 seconds to put the correct letters next to numbers 1 to 7. So you're going to end up, for example, the ovary produces the egg, so therefore it would be 1 with a G. So let me move the question for you, and I'm going to give you a minute in which to write down a number and a letter that matches the part. Off you go. So let's have a look at your answers. We're going to add these to the diagram labels in a second. First of all, let's start with the ovary, number 1. So you should have 1 connected to the letter G on your page. Number 2, we've got the testes, and the testes produce sperm. Number 3 goes with A. The urethra carries sperm out of the body. Number 4 goes with B, the oviduct. It carries eggs to the uterus or womb. Number 5, the sperm duct, is E. It carries sperm from the testes. Number 6 is called the glands. It adds fluid to the sperm. That makes the semen. And finally, the scrotum, which protects the testes. And that finishes number 7 with D. Now, what I would like you to do now is to spend some moments adding the functions from A to G to your diagrams, so that you now have diagrams which have those functions added to them. So I'm going to give you now a couple of minutes to do that. Obviously, if you need more time, you'll need to pause the presentation so that you can still see the labels. So you're adding the labels from the right hand side to the male and female reproductive parts that you have on the diagrams you've drawn already. Off you go. Okay, so we have spent a lot of time in today's lesson producing beautiful diagrams with all kinds of labels, and we have definitions of different parts of the male and female reproductive systems and what they do. And we now need to start using that information because we've essentially completed the challenge. Learning outcome above, where it says identify the correct terms for male and female reproductive organs. We now need to be able to plan the journey of gametes. And of course, gametes are sperm and egg, male and female sex cells. So here's our question. Where does the sperm start from? And what does it travel through to leave the male's body? If you look at your male diagram with the labels, you now need to pick through it and get the correct order that the sperm would travel through from where it's made to the point where it leaves the male reproductive system. Now, I'm asking you to try and use what are called temporal connectives in science. to allow us to communicate effectively. So I would like you to, for example, start with the male testis, and then I'm going to use the word next, which is our first connective. It then travels through the sperm duct. After that, okay, so you can see what I'm using, the 3 temporal connectives, next, then, and after, and I'm trying to write a sentence that allows me to communicate effectively how the sperm travels inside the male reproductive system before it leaves the body. We're going to extend this in a minute to include where it travels inside the female reproductive system. Okay, so let's start off with the journey, but let's put it with bullet points. Okay, so you should have identified from your diagram that the journey starts with the testis, where the sperm is produced. It then goes into the sperm duct, and then from the sperm duct to the urethra. Now I need to write that into sentences using these temporal connectives that we have above that allow us to describe that journey, how it changes with time, or temporal. So first, the sperm is made in the testis. Next, it travels through the sperm duct. Then it leaves the penis through the urethra. Okay, that would do as a sentence. Let's see how you've done. First of all, let's just check the spelling that we've got there and make sure that you've got the spelling correct in your sentences that you have written. Just have a quick look through those, especially urethra. Okay, now let's look at some other aspects of what you've written. So we've already checked number 1, have you spelt the key terms correctly? Let's to make sure that we have got appropriate punctuation. Do we have commas? Do we have capital letters? Try and reread your work back to you and a full stop at the end. Let's just make sure that we have those organs in the correct order for number 3 as well. Okay, let's move on. Okay, we're moving through our Aspire very nicely. We've already done the journey now inside the male reproductive system. We're now going to continue that journey where the specialized sperm cell with its tail would continue. So the sperm is now inside the female vagina. Once in the female, where does the sperm now travel to meet the egg? Now you need to now state the correct order and try to use again connectives such as next, then, and after. So we are traveling in the correct direction. Let's just be clear that we are moving from the vagina upwards in this instance. So that will be your first word, but we need to make sure that we have got the journey next upwards to meet the egg. So have a look at your diagram and see if you can list those, but then connect them up with some of these temporal connective words. You've got 1.5 minutes again. Okay, excellent. Let's see if we can complete this piece of work then. So the journey begins in the testis, and we've already said sperm duct and urethra, and now we're at number 4. So we, as I have said, we start inside the female reproductive system at number 4, the vagina. So the sperm then would travel through the vagina, through the cervix, uterus, and then oviduct. Now we're trying to use these connectives, so we could say then the vagina, afterwards in the cervix, then the uterus, and finally in the oviduct, or then in the oviduct. So please just check your spelling again of those words, especially words like oviduct. And then just reread the information that you have. Make sure that you've got the full stops and commas and capital letters that you would need in those. Okay, hopefully you've now used lots of those keywords, and you've also used that diagram effectively to describe that journey for the Aspire, so that we can plan the journey of the gametes. Now the egg and the sperm are adapted to make those journeys, and that will be the subject of later work that you do as part of the GCSE course. So again, just checking, have we spelt the terms correctly? Have you got the punctuation correct? Have you listed the organs the sperm travels through in the correct order? Just have one last look and check those. Right, we've come to our plenary, and let's have a short question and answer session and see what you know. So just sit back and let's see if we've learnt some things as we have gone through today's presentation. Simple questions, just recall, but feel free to look at your notes. It will help you to picture them in your mind later. Question number 1, which gland produces testosterone? So this is right from the start of today's lesson. You can see it's got test written at the beginning of it, so hopefully that's helping your recall, and the answer would be the testis. Okay, now I've changed question 2 slightly and changed the direction. What do the ovaries store? And this isn't about hormones, this is about eggs. And then here comes a long old list. Okay, what is the journey of a sperm to meet the egg? So there's no temporal connectives, there's just a list under here. If you close your eyes and picture the journey you've just written about, how far do you get with that? Starting with the testis, finishing with the oviduct. So we could put the word next between those if we wanted to. Testis next, sperm ducts next, urethra next, vagina next, cervix, and next oviduct. It's not very developed, but we certainly can demonstrate that we know the parts of the reproductive system. So let's finally just look at our learning outcomes for today. For our challenge, we had to identify the correct terms for male and female reproductive organs. So we've learnt lots and lots of labels, but also what those parts do as part of the reproductive systems. So we have a real in-depth knowledge now of the parts of the reproductive system. And then for our Aspire, we've then used that knowledge and applied it very, very directly to plan the route of the male gamete sperm in travelling to meet the egg to cause fertilization to occur. And this is really important, is the learning from today's lesson, because yet again it now will be used in our next lesson, where we start to look at the menstrual cycle and the release of the egg so that fertilization occurs at an appropriate moment. Thank you for staying with this presentation today, and goodbye.